Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining with us this afternoon, especially Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say that it's a great honor for us to welcome Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon in this first day of event, sharing with us his perspectives about monetary economics. And I would like to thank all students and all collaborators that help us in the organization of this event. Thank you very much. This event is very important for us because we are celebrating 40 years since the creation of the undergraduation course and 25 years for the creation of the graduate program. So it's a very important event for us. Thank you very much, Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon. And now I would like to ask Professor Gustavo Serra to introducing Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon for us.
Hello. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event today. Just a brief explanation. The event is going to be in English, but after the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session. And if you want to make any questions, you can ask in Portuguese and we translate the question to one of the members of our table today, okay? So first, I would like to welcome Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon. He's full professor of economics at Laurentian University in Canada, where he has been teaching since 1994. I have many information here from the web page of Laurentian University, so please update me if any of it is out of date.
It's 2004.
Oh, okay. All right, so here it's saying that in 2004 you had published 125 articles, so I imagine that this number is way higher right now, and you wrote and edited 26 books. So I don't know how many more you have now, but we can say many things about Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon, but among them he's founder and editor emeritus of the Review of Keynesian Economics. Is also editor-in-chief of Review of Political Economy. I think those are two new recent books that you're co-editing. New Directions in Post-Keynesian Economics, and the elder series on central banking and monetary policy, which is also the topic here today. And besides having published many papers in different journals, besides being editor and reviewing for many journals and being visiting scholar in different countries such as Australia, Brazil, France, Italy, Mexico, among others. He has also a very interesting institute, the Monetary Policy Institute. And the Monetary Policy Institute features a blog which I recommend to you in case you want to read up-to-date monetary policy discussions in this heterodox literature. Okay. Well, we also have today here Professor Ettore Gallo. He's assistant professor in economics at the University of Bari in Italy and economic advisor at the OECD. He received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, which I forgot to say, Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon also received his PhD at the same university. Myself. In Cototel with Sapienza University in Rome. And his research focuses on macrodynamics of fluctuations and growth. In particular, he has worked on post-Keynesian economics models of growth and distribution, and ecological macroeconomics, and also monetary policy. Why not? So thank you for being here today. So let's start with Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I want to say that it is a small world because Tony and I have written the paper that will come out in my journal in January. Sorry?
That's what I'm going to present.
And so you'll get to know what that's thank you very much for this invitation. I'm quite honored and humbled to be here for this amazing opportunity, this celebration of your department and your programs. So thank you very much. I've been in Brazil for a month now, and it's always such a wonderful opportunity to discover a new city, a new university like Aguara. I do want to salute the workers that are striking right now. I wish them success in the negotiations. And since we are in a building about chemistry, an economist and a chemist walk into a bar. That's all I have. I'll finish the jokes later. So I was asked to give a talk today on when are central banking and interest rates a hindrance to reindustrialization. And so I'm going to give a talk on monetary policy and the role of central banks from a very critical perspective. Has anyone here taken economics 1 introduction or money and banking? What I'm going to show you today is very different. It's a very different approach. And it's a very critical approach about mainstream models of monetary policy. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over and criticizing that model. And in another talk, I go step by step into the 8 or 9 different parts of the model, and I deconstruct, and I explain why this model is absolutely unrelated to what's going on around it. And this has a really real application today, because with inflation now above 10% here, in Canada and other countries it has come down, but it was very high for a very long time, and we'll touch up on this in a little bit too. Well, it's a real problem in the sense that monetary policy has taken over the policy sphere. And it's this idea that only monetary policy can find a solution to inflation. So I'll have something to say about that. And this is what we call monetary policy dominance. And fiscal policy is sort of just pushed aside with the argument that fiscal policy is inflationary, or leads to higher interest rates, crowding out effects, and all of that. I'm not going to talk about that per se, though I will touch on fiscal policy at the end. And the answer to this question, whether central banking and interest rates a hindrance, will become very clear as this presentation moves forward. A few things. So like it was mentioned, I did create the review Keynesian Economics. I'm now editor-in-chief of the Review Political Economy, and I helped create this new journal called Advances in Economics Education, which is dedicated to, I'm a consulting editor for that. How to teach economics, what to teach, how to teach economics to undergraduate students, to graduate students. So currently, there's a symposium in this journal, as well as in my journal, on the gendered dimension of economics, how to incorporate gender into economic analysis, and how do we teach gender And this is the book series that was mentioned, and it's the Elgar series on central banking and monetary policy. And the purpose of that series, and this is an initiative of the Monetary Policy Institute, is to push the thinking of monetary policy forward. And some of the books, income distribution, this is an old topic for post-Keynesian that goes back to 1986 or so. So 40 years. It is a topic that has come up in the mainstream, but from a very different perspective. The issue of central banking and the environment, and e-money and all of that, and gender. This book is coming out. That was a very difficult book to edit because there's not a lot of research being done on monetary policy and gender, financial stability, social responsibility, etc., etc. And there's a couple of books on emerging countries like in Brazil. This one edited by Fernando de Paula at Rio, and Fernando Filho, who used to be at Obteve, retired now. So this is sort of the whole purpose of that series, is to sort of take on the way monetary policy is taught from the mainstream perspective and argue that there are things that are just not, they don't add up. This is the blog. If you are on Twitter, I would encourage you to follow us. We publish a blog every Monday. It's rather successful. And of course, I'm a post-Keynesian, which means I find inspiration in Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and others, Robinson, Gillespie. But, I wouldn't be a true post-Keynesian if I didn't name my dog John Maynard Canines. But friends call him Maynard. Okay. So I mentioned this. Central banks have always been at the center of macroeconomic policy. It's always one of the tools of policy, fiscal policy on one hand, monetary policy on the other hand. There's always been discussions on compatibility between the two. We should use a mix of fiscal, a mix of monetary policy. But I would say that in the last 30 years or so, the idea of using fiscal policy has sort of fallen away. There's a famous quote that says, by Mankiw, an American economist, that says, "I don't know any economist under the age of 40 who's a Keynesian." And Keynesian is usually associated with the use of fiscal policy. So in the last 30 years ago, we've witnessed sort of the rise of monetary policy, but the exclusive use of monetary policy. That is the idea that only monetary policy should be used to regulate economic activities, on the one hand. And on the second hand, in the hope of achieving low and stable inflation. And so a number of countries since 1990 have adopted an inflation targeting system, which is giving the central bank a specific target for inflation, around 2% in most countries, or a corridor system between 1% and 3%. And central banks have been mandated by law to achieve that 2% target. And so, like I said, no role for fiscal policy. And this goes back to 1990, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But, the dominant idea was to install a mentality of fiscal austerity. And this is the idea that budgets should be balanced, government should be small as a percentage of GDP, but in essence, small government, balanced budgets. And that mentality dominated until 2008, 2009, which corresponded to the financial crisis. And at that time, many countries, and I would say reluctantly, in Canada, the Prime Minister did not want to adopt fiscal policy to help with the crisis, but was sort of painted into a corner and had no choice. And then in 2009, a lot of countries adopted fiscal policy. And that lasted, about a year, because by 2010, unfortunately, in Toronto, where I live, at the G20 meetings, they agreed that the fiscal experiment was over, and they went back to fiscal austerity. But interestingly enough, when the revival of Keynes in 2009, the brief revival of Keynes, led Robert Skidelsky, who is sort of this biographer of Keynes, wrote big books on Keynes' life, wrote a small book called The Return of the Master. Okay? And the idea was that Keynes was back, Keynesianism was back, but that was very short-lived. And by the way, my favorite quote from Keynes is this one. He said, "My only regret in life is that I didn't drink enough champagne." So, take that. And so, the fiscal experiment was short-lived, and we went back to this concept of monetary dominance. And this monetary dominance assumes a very specific transmission mechanism. How do changes in interest rates impact the real economy? How does it impact economic activity? And I'm going to come back to that at the end and explain how post-Keynesians see that transmission mechanism. But this mainstream model assumes a two-step process. First, changes in interest rates impact output. Now that's your famous IS curve, right? Your aggregate of your IS curve, right? Built in interest rate output space, and you got a downward sloping IS curve. If interest rates come down, output goes up. Great, that's the first step. The second step is that increase, or let me do it the other way around. If interest rates go up, output falls. And if output falls, unemployment goes up. And that's because of your Phillips curve. Remember that curve. Well, if unemployment goes up, inflation comes down. So whenever inflation is above your inflation target of 2%, that tells the central bank, we have to increase interest rates, which will reduce output, raise unemployment, and through the Phillips curve, bring inflation down, and hopefully down to target, and hopefully with a soft landing, right, without creating a recession. And that's the mentality. And this is ingrained in every central banker. Every central banker believes this, but does it work? Is that how monetary policy really works? And the purpose of this talk today is to say no. The IS curve relationship is weak, as is the Phillips curve. Most people talk about, the death of the Phillips curve, the flattening of the Phillips curve, etc. And if this is true, and these are empirical questions, and there have been empirical results and tests, and if this is true, then it leads to this conclusion. The mainstream model of monetary policy is built on nothing. There's nothing left. And so it raises the question of, well, what does monetary policy do? And that's where the post-Keynesian answer comes in. So, is monetary policy effective in controlling inflation? My answer is no. Okay. So this model not only relies on the IS curve and the Phillips curve, but it requires an elastic curve, IS curve. Because the central bank needs those degrees of freedom such that when they raise interest rates, it has to have a significant impact on output. If you raise your interest rate and output, consumption, investment is not responding, then you have a problem to begin with. And then what happens is, well, they raise interest rates again and again and again and again. They're trying to exploit that sort of inelastic component of that IS curve, and often to disastrous results. So the more sensitive the response, the more potent is monetary policy, the more effective it is. So if your IS curve is elastic, a little bit of increase in interest rate will have a large impact on output, and that's what you all want if you're a mainstream, if you're a central banker. You want to be able to exploit that curve. Yet the evidence seems to indicate that in both cases, like I said, it's not very statistically significant. And I'll clarify that as we move forward, but that's what I want to say. And this is a great, Keynes has told us there are several slips between the cup and the lip. And this is sort of the same spirit of this great quote by two post-Keynesians, Philip Orestes and Malcolm Sawyer, both British, who said it is a long and uncertain chain of events from an adjustment in the interest rate controlled by the central bank to a desired change in the rate of inflation. It's a long and complicated chain of events. And for the record, I haven't said this, but monetary policy is not about money supply. No one cares about money supply anymore. It's irrelevant. Okay? Money, the quantity of money in existence is simply the result of economic activity. So it has nothing to do with, central banks can't control the money supply. In fact, they tried to during the Friedman years of the 1980s, and it failed. And a number of central banks around the world have just given up on controlling the money supply. We don't care anymore. In fact, there's some great quotes by some central bankers who said, we cannot give up on monetary aggregates. Monetary aggregates abandoned us. Right? So now, really monetary policy is just interest rates. Okay? When I was in Michigan as a young professor, I invited the president of the Chicago Federal Reserve to come and give a talk. This was a talk to, business people and the bankers and of the town, of the city I was in, Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he spoke for an hour about interest rates. And at the end, this woman, Mary Harper, raised her hand. She goes, you're a central banker. You come to us for an hour. You never mention money supply. And he replied, money supply? We don't care about money supply. Okay? So, I don't know if you're still being taught central banks, money supply, etc., but that's just a model, it's a 40-year-old model that needs to be updated. Okay, so what central banks do is they have a target inflation rate, 2%. And they use that interest rate. They increase it, reduce it, increase it, with the purpose of trying to keep that inflation on target at 2%. The problem is the first country in the world to inflation target was New Zealand in 1990, Canada in 1991. And I spent a great amount of time reading a lot of papers and memos and documents from the Central Bank of New Zealand from starting at around 1985 to 1990 to try to figure out where does this 2% come from. And I couldn't find anything. There's nothing about why 2%. And it matters. Imagine if your inflation target was in Brazil 8%. Well, you'd be almost there. In Canada, if our inflation target was 3%, we would have been there by now. We're at 2.7%. So the choice of that target is important. Why 2%? Ben Friedman, not related to Milton, but Ben Friedman from Harvard, Benjamin, he, in a Festschrift in honor of Vittor Constancio, writes, there is this arbitrariness. See, arbitrariness means whatever. 2, 3, whatever. It's arbitrary. It's this arbitrariness surrounding the current 2% target. In retrospect, the paucity, the lack of serious empirical research underlying the identification of the 2% norm, not quite some time ago, is a professional embarrassment. I could not have written a better indictment of inflation target. So Friedman is an extremely well-respected economist, and he says we should be ashamed of ourselves for having adopted a 2% target with absolutely no research being done on this. Emmanuel Carré from France, he wrote, economic theories have played a limited role in the creation of inflation targeting. And he's right. Right? Absolutely right. And this is what I've written on this, and so we're getting off on a really bad foot here. That's what I'm saying. You know, one of the most important objectives in any country is to keep inflation low and stable at 2%. And that target has been completely, the idea behind it is, now not the idea of inflation targeting. That's something quite different. Is inflation targeting, has it been successful? Maybe someone can ask me why inflation has remained, except in the last year, why hasn't inflation remained at 2%? It must be that inflation targeting is successful. I have an answer for that if you ask me. But what I can say is that inflation targeting was adopted in 1990. Inflation from the 1980s had been coming down since about 1984, 85, from a peak of 20%. And inflation had been coming down well before the adoption of inflation targeting. So in my opinion, the adoption of inflation targeting is not responsible for inflation coming down in the 1980s. But inflation has remained at around 2%. Interesting, but I have an answer for that. Okay. So, we've sort of gotten rid of this idea. We sort of completely destroyed the idea of a 2% inflation target. What about the IS curve? Right, the IS curve is, you know, that you need your interest-sensitive components of aggregate demand, consumption and investment, to be sensitive to changes in interest rates. You want that central bank to be able to raise interest rates and lower activity. That's the first step. Now, Stephen Fazzari, I forget their name, but anyways, wrote, Mark Setterfield was his PhD supervisor, right? So he wrote, Barry Cinnamon and Stephen Fazzari, the transmission mechanism from changes in interest rates to aggregate spending in new consensus models, this is what these models are called, mainstream and new consensus models, relies on the interest sensitivity of consumption. It is difficult, however, to find empirical evidence that households do indeed raise or lower consumption by a significant amount when interest rates change. In other words, consumption is insensitive to changes in interest rates. Some authors have generalized the link to include business investments, but a robust interest elasticity of investment has also been difficult to demonstrate empirically. Now, what I want to say is, I agree at 95% with this quote. But I think what they mean is consumption and investment are insensitive to incremental changes in interest rates. But if you raise interest rates 11 times now in the US, going for 12, In the early 2000s, it was 13 times. If you raise your interest rate, the cumulative impact of those changes will eventually, destroy your consumption and your investment. Investment depends on expected profits from a new investment. If you increase your interest rates so high, eventually it will collapse. But it's true. And this is what central banks do, right? They raise interest rates and then they wait, right? They have a wait and see approach. They wait and see. And they go, oh, that's strange, nothing happens. And, is it something I said? Is it something I said? And so they wait and see, and they go, oh, nothing's happening. Because they think that they're on an elastic IS curve, whereas the real IS curve is more inelastic. So in the real world is saying, no, we're not responding to these incremental changes. Central bankers are going, that's funny, in theory they should. Okay, well, let's raise interest rates again. And again. Nothing. And again, and again, and again. And then finally, right, this is a debate over soft landing versus hard. And so by construct, the new consensus model must lead to a hard landing, must lead to a recession, must engineer a recession. Question mark about this one, but anyways. So if you don't want to take the word of some silly new school post-Keynesians, let's quote the central bank. Let's quote the Federal Reserve. This is a great quote. A large, not just a few papers, right? A large body of empirical research, not just theory, empirical research offers mixed evidence, at best, for substantial interest rate effects on investment. Our research found that most firms claim their interest plans to be quite insensitive to decreases in interest rate and only somewhat more responsive to interest rate increases. And that's because investment depends on long-run expectations of the growth of aggregate demand. Right? And changes in interest rates may affect aggregate demand in the future, may affect the expectations of growth in aggregate demand. That's how it would work. But, they're saying, okay. So that's another reason that maybe the IS curve is not Krugman. It is a dirty little secret of monetary analysis that any direct effect on business investment is so small that it's hard even to see in the data. What drives such investment is market demand. Great. The IMF. There appears to be little unexplained component of business investment beyond the expected demand effect. In other words, after you take into consideration expectations of demand for investment, there's nothing left to explain investment. Other factors such as reductions in cost of capital thus appears to have played a relatively minor role. And this is something that we've known for a long time. Bob Hall wrote, the evidence is disappointingly weak. Okay. So, what do we have so far? We have a model, an approach to monetary policy based on an inflation targeting policy that is not rooted in empirical research. We have an IS curve that seems to be crumbling statistically. And for, some people have accused me of, oh, you're just using, simple models, etc. I went to look at the Hank and Tank and Rank models, which are just fancy names to say dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. Fancy, complicated models. But they say the same thing. They say the exact same thing. I found many papers that say this. Okay. Now, the Phillips curve. Now, this is interesting. So imagine the IS curve works. Let's say the IS curve works. Let's give them that. after that increase in unemployment, for inflation targeting to work, you have to be able to have an impact on unemployment and on that relationship between unemployment and inflation. That's your Phillips curve, your downward sloping Phillips curve. And it's important. Here, NBR and Bullard say, it's a key input to monetary policy. That's what you need. Yet, Claudio Boreal, the chief economist of the Bank for International Settlement, the response of inflation to a measure of labor market slack has tended to decline and become statistically indistinguishable from zero. I said, see, the quote is so good I put it twice. That's what such a good quote. And Bob Gordon, who is the brother, of course, of David Gordon from the New School, was there ever a Phillips curve? Now, I published in the review of Keynesian Economics, I published a symposium in honor of Friedman's 50th American Economic Association address. And there was some great, Bob Solow wrote a great paper which is really worth reading. The slope of the Phillips curve itself has been getting flatter. Now, if that's true, imagine a flat curve. Your Phillips curve has inflation up here and unemployment down here. If it's a flat curve, it means that for a given inflation, you can have any level of unemployment. Okay? And so, unemployment goes up, right? And that's why people like, who's that guy who was in the Caribbean with palm trees?
Summers.
Larry Summers, he was in the Caribbean smoking a cigar. He wasn't, but I think it fits the image. Smoking a cigar, the ocean behind him, palm trees waving in, and this is true. And he says, we need more unemployment to bring inflation down. And what that means to me is that this guy has no knowledge of empirical research. Because a lot of people have been saying that Janet Yellen, the former Fed chief, it's diminished. In other words, the Phillips curve has become quite flat. And so if that's the case, if you really want to have an impact on inflation using monetary policy, you got to raise it and you wait. Nothing happens. You got to raise it. You got to raise it. You got to raise it. And what you're doing, you're just sliding along your IS curve. And the IS curve, you create and the IS curve will have maybe a downward sloping component at the very end. But you got to get there. And you're sliding along your IS curve, unemployment 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then finally, the economy completely collapses and inflation. So, and these are just more quotes, and I got a million of those quotes. And this is interesting, because the response, I live next door to an economist. I know, two economists brings down the value of the property in the neighborhood. But he was educated at Oxford, he's pretty mainstream. He keeps telling me, no, there is a Phillips curve. We just have to assume it's there. And that's the problem, and this is exactly what Jerome Powell has said. The Phillips curve continues to be meaningful for monetary policy. Of course, but we don't know what it is. It's flat, maybe, or whatever. But, it's not dead, it's simply hibernating. So we just have to assume it's there, and that it's going to come back to life. I think a policy maker has to act on the view that the basic relationship will assert itself in a reasonable period of time. We have to assume that it will come back. So what we have so far is the inflation target itself not being rooted in empirical research, the Phillips curve being statistically weak, and the Phillips curve, IS curve, and the Phillips curve being statistically weak. There's nothing left of this model. Gavin Davies from the UK central bank, without the Phillips curve, the whole complicated paraphernalia that underpins central bank policy looks very shaky. So he's saying, yeah, our own philosophy, strategy, ideas about monetary policy, that transmission mechanism is very shaky. And so the answer to when central banking and interest rates become an impediment, that's the answer. There is no, it's because you have economic policy, monetary policy, based on a weak model. And so, as long as that is the case, it will always be a hindrance. Even when interest rates are zero, you do not have an explosion of investment, which is what that model expects. You don't. And so the whole concept of monetary policy dominates. The idea that only monetary policy solves the problem is simply wrong. And for me, monetary policy should not be used precisely to fine-tune the economy. It's not what it's supposed to do. Central banks were created to protect the financial stability of the system. That's what they were created to do. And that's what they should be doing. Make sure that interbanking markets are liquid, making sure there's enough liquidity, making sure the system runs smoothly. We're asking central banks to do something they were not meant to do. This idea of fine-tuning emerges in the 1940s under Roosevelt. And so we've given this task to central banks that they're perhaps ill-equipped to do that. Joe Robinson, 1943. Joe Robinson, if you don't know her, was a student of Keynes, and I think in many ways she was superior to Keynes. And she says in 1943, the regulating effect of changes in the rate of interest was at best very weak. And again in 52, in her little book on interest rates, she calls that fine-tuning a false sense, the use of counter-cyclical monetary policy, and rejects the conception of an economy which is automatically held on the path of steady development by the mechanism of the rate of interest. But it is by no means easy to see how the monetary mechanism is supposed to ensure how the rate of interest actually assumes its full employment value. The automatic corrective action of the rate of interest is condemned by its very nature to be always too little and too late. 1943, what a remarkable book. In 52. And so, because of that, because of the wait and see, it's always too little, too late, as Robinson tells us. They raise interest rates 11 times. 12th time probably a 13th time. And so, in a paper I wrote with Mark Setterfield, because reaction functions rely on fine-tuning the economy as needed, the central bank's policy obsession with inflation often translates into repeated increases in the rate of interest until the economy finally collapses in the misguided pursuit of a soft landing, something I call the Holy Grail. Right, if you know the story of the Holy Grail, we've never found it, but we keep looking for it. And Bart LeBlanc, my own supervisor, wrote Inflation Control Can Be Achieved Only at the Cost of Large Losses in Economic Activity. So, let's see where I am. So, we have a problem, you know. And then on top of that, this model, this new consensus model, only works if inflation is demand determined. Oh, right? Interest rates go up, the demand components of those interest-sensitive components of aggregate demand come down. If inflation is driven by any other non-demand, then the model is completely irrelevant. And this, I argue, is what we have right now. When central banks a year ago said, we're not going to raise interest rates because inflation is only temporary, they were right. Inflation was temporary. Inflation came down on its own. And you know, I read newspaper articles all the time that says, oh, look how successful central banks have been. Yeah, interest rates, high interest rates are a problem and we suffer. But look, it's paying off. It has nothing to do with it. The Wall Street Journal last week wrote a wonderful piece, the first, I think, in the mainstream press that has said, wait a second, who are those people that are saying monetary policy may not be responsible for this? So, you know, and for me, the conclusion is this past year of monetary austerity was for nothing. Was for nothing. If central banks had kept interest rates where they were, maybe they were too low. I see it. Maybe they should have come up a little bit. But if they had left them there, around 2%, let's say, inflation would have come down on its own. And people wouldn't have had to suffer so much through higher mortgages, higher, rents, higher debt loads relative to their income, to their paycheck. Okay? How do higher interest rates solve the war in the Ukraine, or the wheat problem, or the bottleneck problem? How do increases in interest rate lead to ports being opened? Okay? This was COVID. Of course the ports were closed or slowed down. Right? So there's absolutely, and this is, for example, the price of oil. Look at the price of oil in 2020. This is when it starts coming up. And it's back down to where it was, close to where it was before the pandemic. These are the bottlenecks. The cost of transporting goods in ocean containers and boats. Look at that. Completely come down to where it was before. This is the same thing. The supply bottlenecks. Look at that. Come back down exactly where they were. And as they were coming down, as oil came down, as the bottlenecks resolved themselves, inflation came down. It was not the result of higher interest rates. This is the same thing. But what we got is an overzealous central bank. Either of these graphs tells the same story. In black, we had the most aggressive monetary policy in history. The most aggressive monetary policy in history. What was the result? The collapse of some regional banks in the United States. Some people getting richer. There are always winners and losers. And the interest rate on bonds increased. And the people, the rentiers, those who bought those bonds, became much richer. Now I have a research project measuring this. I don't have the slide, I should have. But the conference in November in Toronto, where Tony is coming, is built around one of the measures to see how rich did some people become. So was this monetary policy the last year relevant? And then the central banks were saying, oh yeah, no, we know about these bottlenecks, and we know. But what we're really afraid of is the wage prices spiral. They're afraid that workers are going to demand, 2% wage increase, and it's going to lead to more inflation. But look at that. Despite constrained supply of wages, the United States to be driving inflation in the 1970s style. So there is no pressure from wages. And let me say one thing. grocery stores in Canada have announced a 36% increase in profits year over year. 36%. And we applaud them when we say, oh, look at them. Look at how wonderful and successful they are. Yet workers demand 3%, and governors of the Fed, Canada, and England said, you better be careful, because if you increase your wages, we're going to raise interest rates, and it's going to be because of you. Right? So there's a conflict here. Inflation is rooted in this conflict. So not only is inflation rooted, right? This whole concept of seller's inflation, also called profit inflation, this whole concept is that inflation is being driven by greed, corporate greed. I know Isabella Weber doesn't like it when I say that, but it is what it is. That is what it is. And so inflation is based on conflict, and so is the monetary policy response to it. You raise interest rates, people lose, but a lot of people gain. And so for me, it leads to the idea that, for me, monetary policy is about income distribution. That's what it is. The interest rate is not only a cost of borrowing, but it's a revenue on assets. And when these interest rates on these assets go up, people holding, buying those assets, make money. Higher income from rents. And so monetary policy is about income distribution, not about fine-tuning economic activity. Because monetary policy is about lags, right? It takes time to filter through. It's a blunt instrument, right? I've always said that, this inflation targeting is like a fly on your table. And if you want to kill your fly, you can take a little, or you can use a big, right? And you go, bam, and you kill your fly, but you also kill the table on the and so it's a blunt, and that becomes inefficient. Because now you got to rebuild your table, you got to rebuild your infrastructure. Monetary policy can have detrimental effects. So I'm always of the choice that you should keep monetary policy low. You should keep interest rates low and constant. What Mark Setterfield and I call parking. You should just park your interest rates. We favored around. The November conference is about that, at a low rate. And then what you do, well, I'm a Keynesian. I like fiscal policy. I reject the idea of crowding out effects. I believe fiscal policy has crowding in effects. I think monetary policy is impotent. Right? You all know that. That's what monetary policy is. Monetary policy can do stuff, but you got to understand that it has to do the stuff that it's meant to do, not something that it can't do. So let's leave monetary policy alone. And I realize that in a country like Brazil with huge problems with exchange rates, but you got to figure out how do you deal with your exchange rates fluctuations using fiscal policy, capital controls. You have to use other means than interest rates. This is the income distributive effects of monetary policy, right? It affects, at the top, that's the functional distribution of income. This is your personal distribution of income. And this is just how interest rates can generate bubbles. But I don't think bubbles are caused by low interest rates. I think bubbles are caused by the lack of regulations. people will always speculate. People will always try to exploit markets to make money, irrespective of the level of interest rates. What you got to do to prevent these bubbles is to prevent these people from doing what they do. And that comes as a result of regulations. Anyway, that's it. I hope I didn't take, you said about an hour, took 55 minutes. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please. Any questions?
Professor, first, thank you. Can we just have Anthony's presentation
Oh,
first?
I'm
and
so
then we
sorry,
sum
yes.
up all the questions.
Yes. You've got 8 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. We don't have 2 hours. But thank you so much. Of course, I'm pretty sure we're going to have many questions here. Let's just have Anthony's presentation first. You can join us. Well, let me just say in upfront that the timing of your presentation is perfect right now because the central bank is deciding on a decreasing path for the interest rate, and it was almost 14% nominal for an accumulated inflation of 4% a year, which gives us more than 9% of real interest rate. So we don't talk about fine-tuning or soft landing here. And we have an independent central bank doing that. Yeah. And the debate on reducing interest rate, as they were arguing, is like, oh, well, we don't see a wage inflation pressure, but we see the labor market tightening with an unemployment rate of 8%. So let's think of reducing our non-interest rate. But anyway, let's leave more for the questions. And Anthony, please, you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Boa tarde a todos. Funcionando. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Especialmente para o pessoal que está de greve, porque eles, tenho certeza que com algum deles vão ganhar igualdade salarial com as outras universidades estaduais. Okay, I'm gonna switch to English. So I've been a visiting researcher. I don't know. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been a visiting researcher at Unesp over the last 3 weeks. I didn't have much time to, really. It was a kind of peculiar period with the break and the strike now. But I'm very thankful to everyone in the department. I think this is a great event, thank you very much for having me today. Thank you, Gustavo, for inviting me. By the way, Gustavo and I were together at the new school. That's a kind of a new school table here because we did PhD together. Louis-Philippe presented kind of the destructive part of the analysis, why the Phillips curve doesn't work. What I will present today, as I was mentioning before, that's a joint work with Louis-Philippe. What I'm going to present today is kind of more constructive part of the analysis. It's basically continuing where Louis-Philippe stopped with the idea that most Keynesian economists have that inflation is ultimately conflict-driven. So this is the background of my presentation. I'm just gonna, something that is not in the presentation, it's kind of my personal rant. It's part of the discussion that is going on today. If you're on Twitter, read it yesterday. That's funny for 2 reasons. The first reason is that economists in the northern hemisphere, where it's sunny, it's summer, are still debating on Twitter about inflation. And the second thing is that I think it's completely wrong, the argument that they are putting forward. Now, mainstream economists are trying to say again something like, monetary policy managed to bring down inflation, but this was not, the fact that this didn't come together with an increase in the unemployment is a side effect of it. It's something, it doesn't really contradict the meaning, the good working of the Phillips curve, but it's just a side effect. That's an argument Ricardo Reis has recently put forward on Twitter, and also Macro Music, which is a podcast on Spotify. It's quite interesting actually. And his argument is like, if you have a bacteria, then if you take an antibiotic, this will screw up your, this will solve the problem, it will solve the bacteria problem, but will also have side effects, like unemployment, right? And Blanchard, I think rightly, argued, from a more, neo-Keynesian or probably more intellectually honest perspective, this should not, that's not the way we mainstream macroeconomists understand the issue. This should be a causal mechanism going from higher interest rates to higher unemployment. So the whole fuss about the debate within the mainstream, within the heterodox strands of economics about inflation has been, quite the topic over the last year. And as also Louis-Philippe mentioned, there was the resurrection, even within the mainstream, particularly Blanchard and Krugman mentioned this last year, that the theory of conflict-driven inflation could be useful in explaining the resurgence of inflation. The way they do that is, they argue that inflation might be conflict-driven because they want to prove or to defend the idea that wage price spiral would be possible. So central bankers should be particularly keen on restraining wage increases to keep inflation down. The problem with that is that the idea of a wage price spiral in the current scenario is completely wrong. Josh Bevans, as early as July 2022, has showed that rising prices are mainly to be attributed to rising profits. So if there is a side of the income distribution from which price increases are coming, these are profits. And this was also documented by Ambler and Kovner, that showed a positive relation between gross profit margins and inflation. And this is pretty compatible with a point made by Isabella Weber and Evan Wessner in a paper in the Review of Keynesian Economics, and their idea of seller inflation. The evidence goes on. Konskal and Luisani also observed a significant and abrupt rise in markups, especially in 2021, and particularly pronounced among companies positioning the higher end of the income distribution, of the markup distribution, sorry. There is quite some evidence that first, wages did not contribute to inflation, and second, that profits did contribute to inflation through an increase in markups. Also, open parenthesis, this is a US story, so I'm sorry, that's a bit unfortunate to come here in Araraquara and tell a story about the US, but as a true gringo, I never really understood interest exchange rates. So the idea of this paper that we are working on with Philippe is the investigation of the current wave of inflation through post-Keynesian lenses in a framework that is compatible with both at the micro and macro level. So what we want to do is to contrast the revived but utterly flawed idea of the wage price spiral with that of the profit price sink, meaning profit contributed to inflation after an initial cost push in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and these increased prices through an increase in markups, but the process is likely to be stable. I mean, profit and prices will not increase, will not go hand in hand forever. Inflation rates will come down, and they are actually coming down in the US and in all higher income economies. So 4 facts about inflation, So the first one is, the prices went up more than quantities, we all know that. The second one is that the price per unit of output, so unit prices in the US, again this is only for the US, increased from October 2020, basically it increased on a kind of S-shaped path up to the last observation that we have today, that is February 2023. So we can see as how inflation kind of we experienced positive inflation rates in 2021 and 2022, and then inflation rates start to come down in 2023. So this is essentially the same thing by looking at inflation rates. We can see as the US reached a peak in inflation in the second quarter of 2022, and then inflation rates. If we look at the percentage change from a year ago, sorry, inflation rates went down. Where does inflation come from? If we keep equal to 100 price per unit of output in the second quarter of 2020, what we see that the evolution of unit labor costs was kind of following the evolution of unit prices. So nominal wages for sure was not the main source of inflation, while unit profits from current production went up much more, suggesting as a stylized fact that at least there is a kind of positive correlation between profits and inflation. As a side effect of this, if we look at the workers' share, the wage share in the US, we can see as it did not recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a little increase in the last at the beginning of this year, but essentially after the pandemic, workers were kind of are bearing the brunt of the adjustment of higher prices. So in the paper we argue that the idea of profit-led inflation can be captured by starting with a simple Keynesian pricing procedure in which prices are set as a markup over unit labor costs and unit raw material costs. So I'm not going to present the whole framework, but what's essential, what we have essentially in this equation, that's the same as the one in the next slide, is that there are fundamentally three main candidates to explain price increases. One is a kind of an explained error correction term, driven by expectations and something like a random mechanism that through which cost pushes were translated to prices. The second one is that there was indeed an increase in the price of raw materials and intermediate goods, especially energy, and this was passed entirely to prices at a given markup, and because of that, the price level went up. This created a one-time effect, a one-time increase on prices. The third one, is that markups did increase. So, especially in systemically significant sectors, as Isabella Weber and Basler say, markup did increase in some sectors like basic necessities, basic production inputs, basic circulation, basically transport, energy, and food. There is some evidence that in the US at least, markups did increase, and we try to explain this by looking at a framework in which there is an upward flexibility in the sectoral markup, assuming that firms can raise prices as long as consumer will demand the products produced within the sector. So the idea that the prices, that the markups went up is kind of connected with the fact that in the post-COVID recovery, firms encountered, as Mark Satterfield argues, a permissive pricing environment in which they were able to exploit the increased corporate concentration of the previous years, the increased corporate concentration that was built up in over 30 years of neoliberalism by essentially passing through the increase in costs. First, by passing through entirely the cost increase to prices, and then taking the occasion to use the cost push as a camouflage to allow for markup increases. And of course, if markup increase, the profit share will increase and the wage share will decrease. So, broadly speaking, capitalists gain and wage earners thrive. So I'm gonna skip this part because of lack of time. What we see from essentially, just to give you the general idea, what we see from the second fact is that we had a kind of S-shaped pattern in the increase in the price level, and what we can capture this through a logistic function by which we can look at how the markup smoothly increase up to a plateau. And so this markup increase entirely translated to price increases. So what we have is that prices will go up to a plateau that is the maximum price level that is reached by the economy. But if we look at this in the first difference, actually on inflation rates, what we see is that the inflation rate peaks and then goes down. So the simulation essentially shows what we see in the data, with the profit share smoothly increasing and wage share smoothly decreasing. This is the microeconomic part. What we argue is that this is what happened, at least in some sectors, in significant sectors for inflation. At the macro level, we argue that this, the macroeconomic explanation of what happened and the relation between social conflict and inflation can be traced back to John Robinson, again, an economist that Professor Rochon mentioned before. And John Robinson essentially in the formulated the notion of the inflation barrier in 1937 as essentially a concept in which wage increases translate to price increases, and this is kind of an explosive process caused by worker success in defending their real wages and produces a wage price spiral. However, what John Robinson says, John Robinson really focused on the idea of the wage price spiral, but the idea of the inflation barrier, we argue, is more general. It applies to an environment in which workers are stronger than capitalists if they organize, but it can also apply to an economy in which capitalists are relatively stronger vis-a-vis workers. That is the situation at least we argue is the situation in the US right now. So if we flip the story of the inflation barrier from a story of wage resistance to a story of profit resistance, we can show first that entrepreneurs too can resist an increases in prices, and second, that this resistance in prices, this capitalist resistance can be aimed at a defense of a profit share, and this profit share targeting will cause a price increase at the beginning, and it will potentially engender a temporary increase in conflict-driven inflation. Again, the idea here, in line with the micro framework, is that profit inflation is real, but it's temporary. So the initial increase in profits will produce an increase in prices, but the process will be stable in line with our concept of a profit price sink. Again, I'm gonna skip more the model, but what the model really says is that first, the only necessary condition for to have a change in a permanent shift in the functional distribution of income is that capitalists are able to resist an increase in costs and are able to pass through the increasing costs to prices. If they do so, an initial cost push will be essentially translated immediately at the benefit of capitalists and to the expense of workers. If on top of this model, we then say that the profit share target changes as markup adjusts. So if we keep together the microeconomic aspect, the microeconomic framework of an endogenous adjustment in markups with the macroeconomic framework of profit earners defending profit share target, what will happen is that after the initial cost push shock, profit share will smoothly increase up to a plateau, and wage share will decrease. So, long story short, I'm gonna go to the conclusions. So the first takeaway from the analysis, what we want to show is that, well, first, the Phillips curve is a faulted idea. That's something that Louis-Philippe Rochon already mentioned before. And second, that post-Keynesian economists look at the explain inflation in light and connect inflation and the inflationary process to social conflict. So there is, inflation is always and everywhere a matter of social conflict, but we don't need workers to explain that. We don't need worker resistance to have conflict inflation, even if workers are entirely passive. They are just trying to adjust their nominal wages to the increasing prices to keep their standard of living. If they just kind of have this passive behavior, a cost push shock that is following a cost push shock, if firms can defend a profit share or a markup target, then price will increase, and this increase in prices will be mainly driven by the capitalists, by profit earners. So we argue that with the simple framework that we developed in the paper, there is the possibility to reconcile micro and macro aspects of the current inflation scenario at the microeconomic level by looking at the upward flexibility in the sectoral markup that was caused by the permissive pricing environment that we see in the post-COVID recovery. So after the initial push shock, the increase in markups, at least in some sectors, is useful to looking at this allows to explain why prices kept going up for quite some time, and also helps explain why inflation rates are now going down. At the macroeconomic level, the recovery of the notion of John Robinson's notion of the inflation barrier, caused by profit resistance rather than wage resistance, and profit share targeting, allows to see how at the macroeconomic level temporary profit-led inflation is possible, and I think it's not only possible, it's also realistic in the scenario of the US, and how this led to a permanent shift in the functional income distribution, with implications not only for, with implications mainly for the conduct of fiscal policy and income support policies. So again, monetary policy, to the idea that monetary policy, that there is monetary policy, the idea of the monetary policy dominance should be replaced with that of the fiscal policy dominance to make up for the perverse adjustment in the functional distribution of income that we are experiencing in the US, but not only in the US. But I'm going to stop here and look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
So let's start with the Q&A session, and again, if you want to make your question in Portuguese, feel free.
where the nominal wages are increasing. In this situation, is it possible to observe that effect that you show it? For example, salaries increasing, growth economic salaries increasing, and the share, the profit share increasing, and the profit wage fall. Wage share fall. Is situation is possible in the model?
Well, thank you very much for the question in slides. So, for the micro part of the story, there is actually it's one differential equation. I would not even call it, both of them are not really a model. In the microeconomic level, there is a differential equation that explains why markup increased smoothly up to a plateau. At the macroeconomic level, this is, you can call it a model, but it's essentially kind of an accounting framework where we are assuming nominal, we are considering only nominal income with real income constant. So it's what we are saying is that we are just assuming for the profit earners try to maintain their profit share, and wage earners adapt their nominal income by looking at their nominal wage by looking at nominal income in the previous period. By the way, there is not much novelty in this work. It's just a readaptation of a model from the 50s by Holtzman. So what the essential idea here is that we consider real income to be constant to assume away the problem of effective demand. So we are saying that it's in no way, shape, or form excess demand might be the cause of inflation. So by just looking at the interaction between wage earners' behavior and profit earners' behavior, a sufficient and necessary condition to have profit inflation is that capitalists, profit earners, depend on ours.
I have a question for Louis-Philippe.
Hold on, I need to get closer because I'm old and I don't.
Hi, my name is Eduardo Felipe. Can I ask two questions? They're brief. The first one is about the soft landing you talked about. You used the term holy grail. And I want to know your opinion about if the United States is going to manage to have this kind of soft landing. Because you said, again, you used the term holy grail, and I've seen several reports about Paulo saying that they think they're going to be able to avoid recession and so on. So this is the first question. Thank you very much.
Well. In college, I used to have 2 beers. Now I got 2 more. Okay. That's a good question, because in my presentation, I said at one point, well, I don't know about right now. I think what's different this time is the remarkable rise and decrease of inflation. Normally, we don't see that as evident, as clear. There's inflation, and it remains. First of all, inflation has not been a problem for the past 4 decades or so, right? So this is sort of, for 40 years, there's a generation and a half of economists who never dealt with the issue of inflation. So it is challenging, and I've been having almost daily discussions with my mentors over this. What do we do? What's causing this? Krugman coined the expression immaculate disinflation, right? The idea of the immaculate conception. Mathematics say that somehow, but it's right in the sense that inflation seems to be coming down quickly and fast. And so the reason for more interest rate increases is diminishing quickly. That's why last week in Brazil, you saw a decrease in interest rates. And I think you're going to see interest rates coming down very quickly in other countries as well. So we may avoid, but not because monetary policy has been successful. It has absolutely nothing to do. It's just that in a post-pandemic world, I think people are spending a lot, traveling a lot, and so this exuberance, this aggregate demand exuberance is up there, which makes companies want to maintain levels of employment. This is, I think, the driving force, is expectations of aggregate demand. So you've got that in the post-COVID world, and inflation coming down on its own quickly, which may convince many central banks to say, okay, let's pull back. So we may avoid a recession, but again, not because this model has been successful in any way. I think that's a simple or simplistic answer, and we need to give it more meat to analyze what's really been going on. Okay, what's your second question?
Thank you very much. And the second question is, what should we as